Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amy Scott. I'm the Executive Vice President of Research and Interpretation and the Marilyn B. and the Calvin B. Gross Curator of Visual Arts at the Autry Museum of the American West. First, I would like to thank the 2021 Masters of the American West sponsors, and it's an honor, along with the Autry trustees and staff, to welcome you to another Autry Artists Salon. Joining me today is one of the originators of what has since come to be known as the Western pop art movement, Billy Schenck. Billy incorporates techniques from photorealism with a pop art sensibility to both exalt and poke fun of images of the West. Billy's art is in well over, I think, 50 museum collections now, including the Albuquerque Museum, of course, the Autry Museum of the American West, the Booth Art Museum, the Briscoe Art Museum, the Denver Art Museum, the Mesa Southwest Museum, the New Mexico Museum of Art, and the Phoenix Museum of Art, to name but a few. Obviously, if we were to name all of your collections, Billy, I think that would take the entire hour. With over 115 solo exhibitions in the US and Europe, career highlights include the very recent exhibition, which was a really interesting one, the Briscoe Western Art Museum's 2018 Andy Warhol, Cowboys and Indians, and Billy Schenck, Myth of the West, the Denver Art Museum's 2011 Western Horizons, and the Utah Museums of Art's 2013 exhibition, Bierstadt to Warhol, American Indians in the West. Billy is known for utilizing cinematic imagery, reproduced in flattened, sort of a reductivist, almost minimalist, when we're talking about Western art style, where colors are displayed side by side rather than blended or shadowed for a more dimensional modeling effect. Billy is a genuine and a serious cowboy as well. He's a ranch sorting world champion and the proprietor of the Double Standard Ranch in Santa Fe, New Mexico, his home for the past 2 decades and where he joins me from today. And I understand he's in the midst of a bit of a snowstorm, so we're going to cross our fingers and hope that the technology holds out. It is, in any case, snow or not, an absolutely enchanting place to visit, as I think some of his, anybody who's collected his work and has had that opportunity, and I think a few of them may be on this call, to do that. It's a sprawling compound filled with an impressive collection of Western and Native art, as well as mid-century furniture designed by Thomas Molesworth, all of which is fit for any museum collection, wink, wink. I remember first encountering Billy's work in Santa Fe in the late 1990s and being struck by the seamless fusion of saturated pop art color and line with the classic Western imagery most often associated not with painting, but indeed with film. In fact, it is the meeting of these two genres, I think, the space in between the deadpan, emotionally vacant approach to consumer culture, exemplified by Andy Warhol, and the dewy-eyed nostalgia for a bygone world of lonesome cowboys and marauding gunslingers in the films of John Ford and Sergio Leone. This is where Billy works his magic. It is a creative, imaginative world of graphics and comic book stories, populated with heroes and damsels, gunfights and horse chases, big skies and sunsets, all pictured in a way that demonstrates Schenck's acute awareness of their superficiality, of the fact that the West of myth is an image, not a reality. At the same time, his work is less tongue-in-cheek than homage to these same images and landscapes. The supersaturated colors are beautiful in their intensity. The men and women are rugged and sexy, the kind that seem to live fast and die young. If you have questions during our conversation, please enter them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I wanted to let you all know, of course, that the museum represents something very unique to each of us. And I think it is this personal connection to the West where artists from around the country provide diverse works that represent the landscape, cultures, peoples, and wildlife that is one of the defining institutions of one of the defining strengths, of the Autry institution. So thank you, Billy, you're a major contributor to that. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being included in this Salon series. This is fun.
Absolutely. Well, we're delighted to have you here, as we are, of course, as part of the Masters of the American West, as well
Mhm.
as represented in the Autry collection. And so let's get started. Rob, if you want to start with the first slide, please. So I thought we would talk a little bit about your beginnings, because in terms of Western art, they are somewhat unexpected. And as anybody who knows your work well, of course, knows that you began your career in New York City, although you're from
Yeah,
Ohio and spent time in Wyoming. So you were not exactly a city kid, but you somehow find yourself in the epicenter of avant-garde, of the avant-garde art world, which is Andy Warhol's
yeah,
factory in the 1970s.
right.
How did that come to be? Just let's talk a little bit about that experience first.
Well, I'll just start by saying when I was 18 years old and I got into the Columbus College of Art and Design, the very first exhibition of any kind that I'd ever seen. I'd never been in an art museum or an art gallery, but the museum there in Columbus, Ohio, was featuring the Campbell Soup Can series
Hmm.
of Andes. And this was, so I saw them in September 1965. And then, as luck would have it, I was in New York in February of 1966, and I was broke. Ran into a friend of mine at a cafe at McDougal and Bleecker, right in the middle of the village. And he said, "That's no problem. I can get you a job with Andy Warhol." And I said, "Whoa, you're kidding me." And he said, "No." So we drove over to the Lower East Side, to St. Mark's Place, to the Dom, where Andy was promoting, featuring the Velvet Underground. And I met Andy that afternoon and some of the crew, along with the Velvets as they were coming in. And I just, became a gopher and helped just bring in equipment, set up stuff. And I'd never seen a light show or anything like this experience that they had put together. And it probably was the very first, uh, you know, experience like that had been created. And then I stayed with the Velvets, while I was in New York, and then I went back to art school from there later in the spring. So that was my introduction to, to Warhol and his scene and his art.
And the Velvet Underground, of course, was his famous, sort of edgy rock group,
Yeah,
including a bunch of the film stars, I think, that Andy would go on to feature in film, and
right.
importantly, I think also Lou Reed.
Yeah,
So that was not a primarily. I mean, they weren't visual artists. They were
no,
musicians and
right,
actors for the most part, like Edie Sedgwick, Nico.
right,
um how did it end up in your painting, because of course you've been linked with Warhol ever since, yet
right.
your experience with his was more of like the art performance
It
music
was.
scene.
Yeah, and it was a cutting edge thing. The Velvets were literally an entire decade preceding the punk rock scene. That didn't directly influence me. It was just that I had become aware of Andy, and as I continued through art school and I studied all my art history, and I was looking at everything out there, I also became familiar with Roy Lichtenstein, the whole pop art movement, and simultaneously, Francis Bacon became the hugest influence on me for the 4 years I was in art school. And I just I stopped that series of paintings. It was taking too much out of me emotionally to continue trying to follow in his footsteps. And so I made a total break uh, from that kind of art and decided I had to do something that was a little more sane. And not knowing what that would be, at the exact same time, I had discovered Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns. And that happened when I was in art school over in Kansas City from 1967 to 1969. And a friend of mine who was also a big film buff, I remember specifically dragging me off, in the afternoon to see a double feature Western. And I wasn't specifically interested in Western films or anything, although I had spent many of my summers growing up in central Wyoming, Lander, Wyoming. And I've been to rodeos. I knew, you know, ranchers, cowboy scene and all that, but that was politically a different group or thinking than what I was involved with until Sergio kind of entered my consciousness. And by the time I got to New York in January 1970, I'd seen 3 of the films, the first trilogy, that The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, Fistful of Dollars, Few Dollars More. And then right after I got in New York, the Once Upon a Time in the West was the 4th film that he made. And at that point, I kind of threw my hands up in the air and I thought, God, I want to make Western paintings and do to Western art what Sergio Leone has done to the Western film genre. I knew that he had exploded it. He had changed it. He had altered it forever. I didn't know if, you know, I could make great art like what Sergio did, but I knew I wanted to enter the Western painting genre with just a whole different approach than I knew what existed. And so that's how I flipped the page and started making Western paintings.
Actually, Rob, I think we have a slide that puts a Leone still. There we
Yeah.
go, right alongside one of
Yeah.
Schenck's paintings. And of course, Leone is well known for this, you know, incredibly, you know, modernist vision, and the way that he organizes stills, like this famous scene from Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, I believe.
This is Once Upon a Time in the West.
Oh, Once Upon a Time in the West. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So what was it about Leone's composition, or sort of eye, that was so interesting to you? Because of course it was very atypical for filmmakers to think of any genre at the time.
Well, I quickly did my homework as far as who was this Sergio Leone, and I found it interesting and ironic that it was an Italian, a European filmmaker who now was making Western films, and not even in the United States. They were being made in northern Spain. And his whole vision was completely different than what we'd seen out of the Hollywood, you know, evolution. First of all, there was these characters were totally of a, you know, moral cast. There was no good guys, there was no bad guys. They were just like desert lizards that had come up to life, and and going on to these endeavors that were essentially meaningless. To go find money to do what with? They weren't going to buy a ranch. They had no interest in women. They weren't going to get married. There's no love interest. It was just gunslingers, and it just you know, what a life was cheap kind of attitude. So, and the movies also struck me as being very Catholic, which was very different, again, than Hollywood films. And the settings being in adobe buildings almost always, and the high desert, which I have an enormous affinity with. So the fact that Leone, you know, was doing all of this in desert settings really intrigued me. And then he added the dimension of costuming. You didn't see dusters like this to this extent in Westerns. The hats that they wore were different. Everything was just unique. So coming back around to this image of Once Upon a Time in the West, this is from the opening scene. And I obviously got a movie still of this and projected that with an opaque projector. And the painting that I made, I actually have not seen in 49 years. And I'm amazed you found this. I think it's in Europe. The very first solo show that I did, I was with Warren Benedict Gallery in Soho. I think that was 1971, 72. That show sold out before it opened, which was the most shocking, fabulous event of my life up to that point of me being on the earth. And about 40% of those paintings went to Europe. By 1973, I had a solo show in Brussels, and all that work also was in Europe. So some of the very early work that I did, I haven't seen since I did it and since it was sold.
So your first major exhibitions, first successful major solo exhibitions were in Europe?
Well, no, first in New York with
Okay.
Warren Benedict Gallery. And then I did a second show with Warren, which did very well. And then some friends of mine who are artists living in Soho um, told me about this gallery in Brussels, and somebody couldn't make the commitment. So a slot was open and they introduced me to the gallery owners and they put me in. And so my third show was in Brussels.
Mhm.
And they were all successful at that time.
It's interesting that the Europeans took to sort of the filmic or the cinematic quality of your work so quickly, because of course that is their primary. It makes sense in a lot of ways because Europe's primary lens
Yeah,
for much of the 20th century into the West has of course been Hollywood, and so to have a European
right.
director look at the American West from Europe and then sort of transporting your work or exporting your work there is probably a better term, is interesting. The other thing that I always think about in terms of the connection between you and an artist like Leone is the use
Mhm.
of shadow and sort of the crisp, clean graphics and these long shadows that he would often create to dramatic
Right.
effect. So, Rob, if you want to go back one image, I think to the Jeff Stared piece, we can talk a
Yeah,
little bit about more sort of the classic, Hollywood look, more of the John
right.
Fordian, kind of cinematic feel, and how that enters your mindset, because they're, of course, very different filmmakers. And Ford is often associated with the more sort of traditional link to Western art via
Mhm.
folks like Frederick Remington, who he
Right.
admitted being very influenced by. So the more obvious sort of cinematic influence or
Mhm.
precedent, I think, for your work is somebody like Ford. And
Mhm.
so let's talk a little bit about that. And
Okay.
did that, was there any crossover between, the craziness of the avant-garde underground that was Andy Warhol's entourage, and then the move into John Ford's Westerns, which of course he was quite avant-garde in his own day and has been sort
Right.
of resurrected since. But by the 1970s, I think he was fairly,
Mhm.
his reputation was on the wane.
There wasn't a direct connection at this point early in my career with with Warhol or his entourage. In fact, I found when I stayed with the Velvets, it was kind of jaw dropping. It was intimidating. They were hardcore, using drugs, shooting up all, and that scene when I came to New York to live permanently in 1970, I actually uh, didn't seek out Andy at that point. He did come to my second solo show, but it was on a Saturday. I wasn't there. The music or the gallery director told me that he had come by, which I really appreciated. I didn't know that Andy really did follow other younger artists. I found that out much later. But anyway, so that didn't have any direct correlation to what I was doing with my paintings. But from Sergio, I started buying movie stills. I was fortunate enough living in New York that there were two different places that had literally over 1 million movie stills of everything. And so I just started doing my homework and learning what all the films were, who made them, what years they were made, and all that. So that's when I quickly figured out who John Ford was, because I had no previous knowledge of any Western film. But so I started looking at John Ford movies and, of course, accumulating movie stills where I could find them. And I have as much reverence for Ford as I do Sergio. I mean, they say John Ford was, the most brilliant action filmmaker, and that he shot a minimum of footage because he actually knew what he was doing. So that when I went back to the studio, they could only edit it the way he shot it. There was just not enough excess footage for them to mangle or manipulate his vision. I thought that was brilliant on John Ford's part. This movie still, however, is not a John Ford movie. I don't remember who this character is, but it was from a black and white movie still from the 1940s. And what I like, Jeff stared into the passing of the West. I think, if you read about Russell, Remington, and lots of artists who have come since, they all lament the passing of the West as they've seen it. And we still do it. I mean, the time that I spent in Wyoming in the 1950s and 1960s, well, the West isn't what it was. It's continually evolving. So you have like a nostalgic appreciation for what you knew from decades earlier. And I just thought this was a clever way, to deal with that kind of thought. And the fact that, how do you stare into the passing of the West? You can't physically do that. I love, twisting stuff around to where it's not in reality. It's not possible.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the use of captions, and in particular, and in some of them, the captions seem like in this particular painting, I mean, the guy's sort of slumped down, he's looking off into the distance,
right?
The nostalgic, the kind of the nostalgia of the scene is there in
right.
the pose, in the spading light, in all of it. So why put a caption on top of it? I mean, why sort of restate the narrative in a way that clearly makes the image look more like it's out of a comic book, obviously, than sort of a painting in its own right.
Well, now we come back to Warhol and to Lichtenstein, so that by 1980, I started doing halftone dot paintings, being very aware that was Lichtenstein's forte. And the captions were from the comic book series that Lichtenstein had done in the early 60s. And also having grown up being a fan of comic book art, and that's all I did growing up was cartooning, rather than to learn how to be a decent draftsman or do any kind of serious art making. I was just off on this other tangent of imitating comic book stuff. I like the idea that, could the painting stand alone without the caption? Yeah, it could, but I wanted to direct the narrative. I wanted to give it, a twist. I like to do, what I do sometimes is having a mischievous sense of humor. And I think that's been prevalent in all of these caption paintings right from the get-go. I can't remember when the first ones were, early 80s, mid 80s. So I still do that. When I come back to movie stills, I don't work from movie stills as often now as I used to, but boy, I see images and I have notebooks, pages filled full of captions, hundreds of them. And I rework them, like a poet would be, a wordsmith reworking words until a stanza is perfect. I mean, it's amazing how much effort one has to go into to make it sound just exactly right.
I like the fact also that in this painting, there's sort of like the dot, there's something sort of more to come.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
right.
We continue,
exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
So speaking of cinema, let's talk, Rob, if you can go to the slide, I think that has the stagecoach. Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know that this is a direct quote from that still, but I thought we would talk about of course, this is a black and white still as well, but it certainly has the painting has a very cinematic quality. And I want to talk a little bit about your use of color, because when I think of these kinds of, bright orange and crimson, just sort of unreal, surreal sort of skies, I think first of John Ford, and then I think actually second of New Mexico, where you are now. So what makes your work pop in a lot of ways is like putting these oppositional colors, blue and orange, for example, side by side. And when you're crafting a painting, how is it that you go about, do you know what the overall sort of cinematic effect will be, or do you lay colors alongside each other as you go? Is it an evolution
Sometimes
or
I,
is it planned out?
sometimes I have a very specific notion of what I think it should look like, and other
Mhm.
times I, at this point too, I'm actually making a collage of projected imagery, whether it's my own
Mhm.
slides that I've shot, my own characters, or partially from a movie. Um, and I, I got to tell you, when they're just line drawings on a white canvas, they look unbelievably perfect. And I think, God, I really should not put color to this. I'll mess it up. And sure enough, when I start off, sometimes they work from beginning to end, and then other times I realize as I've put these images together, I don't know what they're going to look like all together until I start applying color, and I find that, oh man, this thing was supposed to be in the dawn, and now it's going to be midday. This looks boring. I have to take these clouds out. I have to. It's a crazy process, and quite
Mhm.
often they'll work, and other times I just lose control of the whole thing. And the issue really is because I paint these flat, if you will, paint by number colors together.
Mhm.
And boy, there's a ton of different ways that they may not work in connection with each other. So it's a
Mhm.
continually a moving back and forth. Like this is too bright. I've got to tone this down.
Mhm.
I've got to make. Sometimes I use silhouette figures in the foreground, like the buckboard wagon in my painting, but I still wanted to have some detail in it. I didn't want to just uh, make a
Mhm.
silhouette in the foreground. I wanted to give it at least some information. And then of course, to proceed, back through the space uh, to get your values correct, to make the eye go back into deep space and then bring it back up and out through the cloudscape.
Mhm.
So it's just trial and error, and it's just doing lots and lots and lots of looking, studying, and
Mhm.
painting before it, in my head it gets right.
Do you
But
work
it's interesting.
at all? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just thought it was interesting that you've picked that image. That's from the movie still is from My Darling Clementine, John
I
Ford,
thought that might be it. Yeah.
1946. Mm.
Yeah.
That's Walter Brennan in the buckboard wagon, about to confront Henry Fonda. My
Well,
painting is
mine,
actually, I'm sorry,
go ahead. No, 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 go
the
ahead.
painting I did is from a back cover of 1958 Arizona Highways, which was originally a black and white image itself.
Uh-huh. Huh.
And
Well,
I
the reason
changed
that I
everything.
select that image has a lot to do with the complexity of color in the
Hmm.
sky.
Right,
And your work is so flat, almost any given shape within the painting appears to be composed of just one color. Yet if
right.
you move from the upper right to the lower left of this painting,
Hmm.
you get a whole range of
Right.
blues, oranges, and yellows, and then pinks and purples and back into blues. So it really speaks to how at first glance, some of the use of color looks fairly straightforward, but the more you sort of get into it, it's not. It's actually
Right.
quite, sort of, it's quite complicated.
Uh, when I started, uh, working from the black and white movie stills, and then as I got involved with the whole rodeo scene, and I started doing rodeo paintings, at that time, I was more interested in pattern and flat, everything being
Mm-hmm.
flat. So it was like much more pop. But then I got interested in, I will say, a more romantic notion about particularly the big landscape images, and with cowboys or Indians or whatever in that landscape. And then I wanted over time to make those more nuanced. And so it really wasn't until 2008, 2009 that I started introducing these blends like what you're describing in the
Mm-hmm.
sky. Earlier I would have probably painted that whole cloudscape just all in hard, flat areas. And they ultimately, to me, weren't as convincing as
Mm-hmm.
what I could do if I used both flat color as well as a gradation, like I did, here in this. This became an early example of what I thought would be successful with blended cloudscapes or skyscapes.
Another reason why I chose this painting is because I think it really exemplifies one of the things that is at the heart of your success and the success of many of your images is the combination of sort of abstraction. So if you just put the painting off right above the wagon and just reproduce the sky, that would be a beautiful painting in and of itself. But then of course you have this sort of classic narrative that enters into the lower foreground. So it really is a conjoining of this completely modern abstract vision, which relies in many ways upon this very sensitive and sophisticated use of color, and then this sort of classic, Western narrative that we all know and can relate to from so many films over the years. Rob, if you don't mind going to one of the, there we go. These are the damsels and the heroines. I thought we would talk a little bit about the one on the left is, by the way, one of my all-time favorites. I believe that was an Autry miniature.
It was
a couple of years ago.
I could have sold 5 or 6 of those that night if they were there.
Yeah, I bet that just flew off the walls. So what it is about these sort of classic, you've got a lot of like classic movie stars in your paintings, like the image on the left, but the girl on the right, you've also got a lot of like tough, hard drinking, gunslinging, women in your painting too. Right. And it seems that, so I thought we would use these two paintings to talk just a little bit about gender and masculinity, because of course the Western genre in its, cinematic and its Golden West formula wasn't known as being like the most progressive in terms of gender roles. But a lot of your work features on these sort of strong, powerful, gun-toting, women.
Yeah, I started doing that in 1980 when I started using, pistols with women, and it just continued, for 40 years doing that. I mean, that's the way I like to present women in my paintings. Are, tough, self-determined. I'm not on all the adjectives, but obviously very strong characters. Something that I don't do very often at all is on the painting on the right, and that's from a movie still from Colorado Territory, and it's Joel McCrea and Virginia Mayo. I don't paint women very often who appear to be less than powerful, and obviously, she's a little more desperate. And I also, I think there's no in Western paintings, I never see anything that's male-female lovers or, at all in Western art. So I like that I'm kind of alone doing that. The other thing that was, I thought, symbolic for me with this, I called it The Last Sunset. And in the movie, these two lovers are having a final embrace, and they're running from the law, and they're in this kind of big old stone compound with a church, and some of it's gutted out and all that. And they get separated. And in the final scene of the movie, they're in Canyon de Chelly, and Joel McCrea is up in a cliff dwelling, and she is already been captured by a posse, and she manages to get away from them and get 2 guns. And the very last scene is her, he's wounded, and now he's down behind her laying on the ground, and she's double-fisted, blazing away at all these posse members. And it is literally this scene the night before. It was their last sunset. So it has another dimension that's significant to me that maybe not apparent, to the viewer. And that's one thing I like doing with the titles, or sometimes the imagery that I do. If it doesn't quite make sense, I'm forcing you to, if you're interested enough, to do some homework and find out what the double entendre is. What is this message? Why is it layered? So there's different messages all inside one image. Not often, but sometimes.
Well, I like that with the women, with the image on the left in particular. You have a way of sort of taking the standard Western narrative and just one-upping it, or tweaking it, or turning it into something that is unexpected, or that contradicts kind of the formulaic understanding that we might have had.
Right.
So speaking of that, Rob, if you want to go to one of the Cowboys in the Cars. So one of the first things that I saw when I got to know your art were these images of modern cowboys in these fancy cars. They're always Rolls or Cadillacs,
Right.
big, expensive American cars, on the side of the road, drinking,
Right.
or just hanging out, or just, it's a really interesting and fun, I think, sort of contrast between the classic Western landscape, the open skies, the
Right.
desert behind them, the rural road, and this, symbol of sort of urban luxury that is not expected. And that's another one of those kinds of, moments of tension where two things come together in your work that just make it pop. So how
Right.
did you get on it? I think some of these are your friends.
Yeah. Well, there's several different things going on here. First, I had seen the movie HUD, 1964, with Paul Newman. It's a black and white film, but he's driving around in a pink 58 Cadillac. They keep making a reference to it being a pink Cadillac. So as I got sucked into this whole lifestyle and started rodeoing myself and all that, I thought, oh man, I got to have my own pink 58 Cadillac, which I finally did do. But then when I first started using vehicles with my Cowboys, I had them in Ford pickup trucks or around Ford pickup trucks. Then I used the pink 58 Cadillac and then other Cadillacs. And then that evolved into, well, let's step it up even more and give them a Rolls Royce. And so specifically in this image, this is an artist friend of mine. We lived together for 8 years back in the 80s. This is Ann Coe, and she still lives in the Phoenix area. And that's me, and we're playing poker. And the other thing I did was sort of a one-upmanship on the female side. She's drinking champagne. I'm drinking a beer. So I'm giving her more class, more, I'm better than you. You're nothing but a punk cowboy. You drink Bud Light, Coors. So that was my little play on the situation. And if you look closely, it's hard to see, but the license plate is a silhouette of Texas. And the wording in it says star-studded state broke. And I painted this in 1983 at the time of a major oil crisis. And it was really hurting the Texas oil business. And I remember specifically, I had started collecting deceased Western art, and there was a lot of it coming on the market and almost all of it coming out of Texas collections. And so on a personal level, I saw this as an opportunity to be able to buy paintings that I couldn't otherwise acquire at a discounted price. So that was my whole social commentary all wrapped into one painting. Ultimately, I only did, this series was short. There was only 6 of these, but the ones where I'm not in them was always Ann Coe. So I made her the cowgirl with the Rolls Royce. She was never with, no, she was with a Cadillac a few times, but she was the Rolls Royce lady.
Sort of like an urban cowboy kind of thing. Are they broken down? Why did this stop?
I never figured out that part of the narrative. I just had them stop in the middle of the desert and decided to play, some poker. I don't know. I will say that the Cowboys and Cadillacs and the cowgirls and Rolls Royces, et cetera, preceded Hollywood when they came out with John Travolta's Urban Cowboy. The kind of cowgirls I was painting and their kind of toughness and with the guns, again, preceded Thelma and Louise by an entire decade. I'm sure they didn't know that I existed, but I like putting it in that context.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of Thelma and Louise, but that actually makes a huge amount of sense, especially now that you talk about the Cadillac. Rob, let's go to the next. I think we have one more of these. Yeah, I think this is also Anne. There she is with her champagne. Another Rolls. And I don't know that we need to talk a great deal about this one, but I just
Oh, there
love,
you are. Yeah.
she reminds me
Yeah.
of these all remind me of they have a similarity to them, to sort of the gun-toting,
Right.
independent woman that populates a lot of your work.
Right.
And it's just it's a fun and kind of a refreshing take on that Hollywood
Right.
stereotype. So let's see,
Well,
let's go to the next. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, I was going to tell a little of the narrative about this.
Yeah,
It says
please.
Hollywood, and the name of the painting is "Hi, Mom, I Made It," which was a direct quote from I. I knew this guy Dan Christensen, who was an artist who had gone to the Kansas City Art Institute, graduated, and became a color field painter, and really successful in New York. And as he started selling paintings, he bought himself a black Cadillac convertible, drove it out to the family ranch in North Platte, Nebraska. And this is his younger brother telling me this story, who was my roommate in Kansas City. Jumps out of their Cadillac. The mom comes out on the porch. He says, "Hi, Mom, I made it." And that was in one sentence, his career in New York. So I just changed it, put a female character with the Rolls Royce and put Hollywood in there, and just reversed it to the other coast. It says, "Here she is. I've made it." I liked it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it works. And again, it's a great example of how you take sort of a basic narrative, you have one simple twist, and just bam.
Right.
Okay, Rob, if we can go to the next. Okay, so these are there's a couple landscapes here that I thought we could talk about. And actually, Rob, let's go to the next one. We can come back to this if we have time. But this, of course, is the painting that you gave to the Autry a few years back.
Right.
My favorite painting, and I think one of your best landscapes.
Yep.
And I will never forget asking you, we included it in an exhibition of new acquisitions, which was centered around the work of the Kaufman collection, and who are also collectors of yours. And I remember asking you about why this painting, where this was or what it was of. And you gave me this answer that was really interesting. It was sort of like, it was everywhere, but it was nowhere. It was, it's a bunch of different places at once, basically. And do you want to talk a little bit about your landscape practice when it comes to kind of composite landscapes and how you do that? Because of course, Thomas Moran would go to the Grand Canyon and look at that rim and put this rim next to it and then get that view. I mean, it was all, and Bierstadt was famous for sort of importing mountains from other places into his paintings. So how did you put this together, and what is it about, what is your approach to landscape relative to film? Because so many of these are iconic landscapes, yet you don't, unlike the stills, recreate images or specific narratives. They're just kind of these assemblages, but they still have this potency to them.
Well, I think I was in New York, and as I became aware of John Ford, I also quickly became aware of the fact that he had used Monument Valley to a great extent, making great, iconic, all-time classic imagery. So I went out to a movie set just over here in Galisteo, New Mexico, in the spring of 1971 to get some more footage for my paintings. And as I left there, I came back up through Grand Canyon, and then, I came through Monument Valley, and I had not seen Monument Valley since I was a kid with my family, I think in 1953. So this was my first time back. And now, of course, I'm very aware of, this is John Ford country. This is what he used as a backdrop to his great films. And so it grew on me, and I did take photographs then, and I kept coming back and coming back. And it became like, Muslims go to Mecca every spring. I go to Monument Valley at least twice a year, and to Canyon de Chelly. So I've become intimately familiar with the landscape in that part of the Navajo country. And so this painting specifically, the front monument is from Monument Valley, and the background, that row of mesas, is from near the Dugout Ranch at Canyonlands. And the tree, I just photographed cottonwood trees everywhere, from Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona. I mean, that is always in my consciousness. And so I like the idea of putting this silhouette of the tree. So it's a portrait, of a cottonwood tree, but it's silhouetted for the most part. And then it just goes back and back into the space. And of course, with my demonic sense of humor, if you remember, I named A River Runs Through It, which is the title of, of a film, which was mostly on Montana and all that. And I just thought it was a riot to name it that, because in this desert landscape, there isn't any river there at all. Nowhere.
Right. I asked you about that. So where there's no river.
No.
So are you, and I think when we had a quote on you on the wall from you when we showed this painting in that exhibition, and it had something to do with, there's no river in there, but the trout are all, 20 inches long, and
Yep.
it's the best, it's the most ideal river that never existed.
Exactly. It's my idea of revisionist history.
Exactly. Well, if you're going to rewrite it, there could be worse ways to imagine it.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I love this painting. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time. I think we have time. A few questions that have popped up, and we're getting near the end, so I want to make sure that we can get to some of these, I think, because there are some good ones. The first is from Adrienne Horwich, who is the sister-in-law of Elaine Horwich, which is a very, very famous art dealer in New York, who gave many, sort of the avant-garde their beginnings. She says, tell us about your time with the Elaine Horwich Gallery. Love hearing your stories about her at the opening last year at the Tucson Art Museum. And I'm sorry, I need to correct myself. She wasn't in New York. She was in Scottsdale and in Tucson. But a lot of early sort of Western artists that became super famous, including yourself, I think Fritz Scholder, Paul Pletka, a bunch of people shared with her.
Yeah, it's true. So what's I forgot what the question is.
Oh, just telling me about your time with Elaine and what that was like.
Well, I had a great early career in New York, in Europe, and that faded. And I was literally out of New York by the spring of 1975. And I went to Jackson Hole, and then that winter I was in a group show in Scottsdale. So while I was in Scottsdale, I decided to stay for the winter. And then I met Elaine, and by 1976, she was representing me, and I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And I had somebody who could relaunch my career, and boy, did she ever. So those were great years with Elaine. And I might mention that those Rolls Royces, those were Elaine's. That was her, the license plate said Art Gal on her plates. And it was just a riot to borrow that car from Elaine. And on the way out to the Fort McDowell reservation, so where we had a desert scene, we'd stop and, at the Circle K and get some soda pops or whatever. Boy, did people treat you differently, like royalty. Oh, look at that. These people are driving up in a Rolls Royce. Wow. Or Elaine would go through the McDonald's drive-through to get a hamburger, a cheeseburger. And it just, the way it raised eyebrows, it was so out of context with how people would normally see anything during the course of a day. Rolls Royce going through McDonald's. Wow. So those were great years with Elaine, as well as her posse. I mean, there was Tom Palmore, there was Fritz Scholder, there's, oh gosh, I can't think of everybody. John Fincher. I mean, millions, just great people.
Somebody needs to do the Elaine Horwich Gallery show. I think that would be, quite.
Well, that show, it has been done. It started at the Tucson Museum of Art, and Julie Saucy, who is the curator down there, wrote a biography of Elaine and all her artists called Southwest Rising. And that show is going to the booth, and it's coming here into Santa Fe as well.
Oh, awesome. So it's still traveling. So we have a chance to hopefully after open up a little bit out there.
And the book is still, she sold most of the books, but there are still some available. I mean, it is the greatest history of Southwest contemporary art, from the 70s through the 90s that's ever been put together. So,
Mhm.
kudos to Julie for having done
Yeah.
that.
Well, that's I'm really happy to know that it's coming to Santa Fe, because as soon
Yeah.
as things open up, that is one of my first destinations.
Okay.
Here's another really interesting question, that a
Okay.
lot of people probably are thinking about. It says, it's from David, and it says, I'm curious about the paint on the wall behind you. Is that intentional, or is that where you wipe your brushes, or both?
Both. The walls are where, when I'm painting, it has to be flat. And these little nodules or whatever, or sometimes a piece of paint that's just hard, gets in the way. It's just easier. Just wipe it on the wall. Just wipe it on the wall. So this is, it's even worse over on this other side. But this is our sort of post Jackson Pollock / Monet. They're not water lilies, but he would do slashes. So I think it's interesting that I come up with these flat finished paintings in such a chaotic looking environment. I used to
Mhm.
paint those walls white, and I said, nah, I'm going to leave that. I like that. So that's the working process. This is a
Cool.
painting I just started the other day. The one up on top is finished. The one behind us is framed on the other side, a descanso. So I just thought I'd, do this whole thing in this environment so people could see,
Yeah.
where it is this stuff happens.
Well, that's a big part of the highlight, I think, is just the fun of getting a glimpse inside an artist's studio is not something that, a lot of people get to experience, certainly not every
Right,
day. And of
right.
course, Paula was a cowboy from Wyoming. So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see, we have time for just a couple more. This
Okay.
is one that I've actually been wanting to ask you too, because there's all, you have been on the Western art scene for some time now. And there are a lot of younger artists now, kind of next gen
Right.
Western artists that you
Yeah.
clearly have an impact on. How do you
And
feel about that?
that's in reverse too, I might say.
Uh-huh.
Um, I mean, I say publicly anywhere. When I met Logan Jaj in
Hmm.
2009, I had been painting, cloudscapes and et cetera, for decades. And I'd looked at NC Watt, I'd looked at Ed Mel, I'd looked at uh, um, Maynard
Maynard
Dixon.
Dixon?
Yeah. And I could get those things resolved somehow, sometimes okay. But boy, Logan really opened a door for me, both with the use of palette, and my palette has changed in the last 10 years. And I think I've resolved this cloudscape business far more convincingly as a result of having met Logan. Now, yes, I have had influence on other artists. I remember specifically in the 70s and 80s, a lot of artists were, you know, doing literal interpretations of my paintings. I think what I see now that's interesting, I don't know if I can take credit for it or not, but you're suddenly seeing other painters with women with guns.
Mm-hmm.
That, yeah, that's all recent. And, I'm going to take credit because I was out in front of it by 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I like the attitude that they're coming up with women that are more, much more self-sufficient, self-determined, but and Hollywood's done it. I mean, look at all the, there's tons of female superhero characters now. I mean, finally, the focus has changed and given women more credit that's
Mm-hmm.
due that hadn't been there before.
An interesting parallel that I discovered just recently, actually, in the course of doing research for another one of these salons with Mark Maggiore, is that his
Mhm.
early photography is women in, street and urban settings, in street clothes with guns. It's all women and guns.
Uh-huh.
And I think
Uh-huh.
early photographs, you can
Wow.
find him. Yeah. And he's somebody who's painting anyway, has evolved in a way I think that clearly shows your influence.
You think?
Um,
Wow. How would the,
I do
okay.
in terms of color, yeah, and cinematic stuff. I mean, he's
Huh.
European, so I think there's a few
Yeah.
things in there, but you're one of them, to be sure. Let's see. One last question. Can you tell us just a little bit about the work that is coming to that is in Masters? It's hung. It's on the wall.
It is. Yeah, I did another small cowgirl, and to be discreet, she is nude, but you don't know that because I've only made the portrait
I wondered
from,
about that. Now I know.
but anybody that pays attention, that's a nude cowgirl with guns, which I have painted. I just don't show them, in the museum environment. So I thought I'd be a little more discreet with that, but still
Like the
give you the
PG version.
essence. Pardon me?
It's like the PG version for Masters.
Yeah, exactly. And one of my favorites is that Box Canyon, which is the big painting, the 47 by 50. And that's a cowboy friend of mine who's in my paintings off and on over the years. I met him when I moved down here south of Santa Fe. He's also in a lot of movies. He's in 16 movies so far, to his credit. And he's been a good model. And I just, I go out here and shoot him over at his place, or we shoot over here at my arena in the back pasture or whatever. And then I placed him in Monument Valley. Because I love, again, there's my John Ford. Let's have an iconic cowboy, and we're going to have the big walls of, a mesa in behind him. So I thought that was one of the best things I've put together in a long time.
Yeah.
And I think there's another, there's a cowboy painting that I think is Surveying the Herd. I'm not sure. And that's,
smaller cowboy painting.
and pardon me? It is
the smaller
Surveying the
cowboy
Herd.
painting. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was from rodeo photographs that I shot. But and again, when I was doing a lot of rodeo cowboys, I very rarely did the action that was out in the arena. I liked doing all of the stuff that was back behind the rodeo shoots, or just at the rodeo shoots, or just as guys were getting down on their bucking horses or bucking bulls. There's this quite often a look of pensiveness or a different kind of intensity and an up close portrait. So that there's just a different kind of drama that's, I think, as relevant behind the scenes as it was out in front of the rodeo arena.
Okay,
And
I think that is perfect. Thank you. We are at about time. However, I just noticed when you shifted a little bit, something behind you that I wanted to ask you about, because it's an aspect of your work that we didn't really get to cover, which is the hat on a cross.
Yes, that's a brand new series.
Can you just maybe shift a little bit and tell us a little bit about that painting, because that is cool.
Can you see it?
I just had to. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad
I had to ask.
That's what I've been painting crosses and descansos for years and photographing. Photographs as photographs. The descansos, these are cowboy descansos. Now here in New Mexico, and they're also in other places in the West, you'll see them as roadside crosses or memorials. And descanso is a Spanish word meaning literally where the soul rests in peace. And they're usually always Hispanic, they're usually Catholic. Nobody had ever done cowboy descansos. So I invented the cowboy descansos. So what I've got is really this is a dead cowboy hat, a cowboy with his hat and his pistol and holster and his boots and spurs. And I've started doing a series of them just since the COVID thing showed up. I definitely like an element of pathos in some of my work. And the challenge to do something like that is, again, with hard edge flat colors, it's obvious to make that pop, but to put an emotional element into the work, I think is more of a challenge. And of course, the descansos are tongue in cheek, but they're also pathos oriented as well.
Yeah, to be sure. Every time you see them, you realize that somebody has died on that spot.
Right.
So it's interesting, because one of the other questions actually that I was not able to get to, and there were several, had to do with the impact of the pandemic on your work. So I think that is a rather solemn,
but
fitting, I think, close to the conversation. Your work is really dynamic, and I think we could have had 10 more of these discussing various aspects of it, including, the use of religious imagery, the cross, the crucifix, some of the penitente references.
Right.
It's just fascinating. You're such a versatile artist. We are so pleased to have you in Masters. I wish we could see you this year, but hopefully next.
Yeah,
So
I
thank
agree.
you.
Well,
Yeah.
thank
And
you.
thank you to all of us, or to everybody on this call, to all of us for taking the time to be with us this afternoon to hear a little more about Billy's work. And please, when you get a chance, go to the Autry.org where you can look at Billy's art, purchase that and others.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you, Billy.
much.
Yeah, it's
Yay.
been great. Thank you so much. Thank you,
You bet
everybody.
you.
Enjoy your evening.